My name is Elise Waller, and I'm an APHM major. And for my research project, I decided to understand the role of a sports medicine professional in the psychosocial rehabilitation of the injured athlete. And I'm first going to start by telling you a little bit about why I chose this topic. I chose this topic because my goal is to become a physical therapist with a specialization in sports medicine. After taking a few other psychology classes along with this one, I realized how important my role will be with not only the physical well-being of my patient as a physical therapist, but also the mental well-being. And research has shown that both of these things, mental and physical aspects of injury, are intricately connected. So I wanted to see the research out there and what it suggested the role of the sport medicine professional really was in the sports injury world. And as an APHM student, I'm very aware of the physical side of what happens with an injury and what goes on in your body during exercise and things like that. However, I'm not so aware of the mental side, and so this is why I wanted to kind of explore this more. So first, I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit of the statistics of just injury in general. So in one high school career, 8 out of 10 athletes are going to get injured. 17 million injuries occur in young athletes just in a year. And the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, has reported that out of 25 sports, there have been over 1 million injuries in the NCAA alone. And so you can imagine that a lot of the other injuries are just not reported. And so you can think of how many injuries actually happen that are much larger than these numbers because they just go unreported. Unfortunately, injury in sport is both prevalent and unavoidable, so we need to understand both sides of the equation. And because of this, the injured athlete has been studied extensively and proves to be a constantly changing puzzle. This research has been devoted to understanding the human body and how to best fix and rehabilitate the injury, as well as focusing on the psychological aspects of the injured athlete. Recently, there have also been studies conducted to understand how the human body and then the psychology of the injured athlete interact during the rehabilitation process. The relevancy of this topic has pushed professionals on both sides of this mind-body interaction to become better trained in creating better outcomes for the athlete. Nevertheless, professionals that are in the middle of the mind-body connection, such as athletic trainers and physical therapists, are finding themselves, though they're well trained in the sport medicine aspect, they're undertrained in the psychology of the injured athlete. So the purpose of my paper was to review and synthesize the essential psychology of the injured athlete and how that relates to the sport medicine world and the sport medicine professionals. So the literature that I reviewed was extensive. There's lots of research on the psychology of the injured athlete and also how it affects the physical side as well, physical rehabilitation process. And most everyone knows now that the rehabilitation process after an injury is both mental and physical. And this has been supported by years of research. And so it actually, those years of research has exposed a weakness in the sport medicine field, like I previously mentioned, that most athletic trainers and physical therapists do not feel adequately trained in aiding in the psychological rehabilitation process during the physical rehabilitation process as well. So it's very important to understand that sport medicine professionals, otherwise known as SMPs in my presentation, are one of the first individuals that interact with the athlete right after they are injured. Usually it's an athletic trainer on the field, and then right after that, they might go to the doctor and then the physical therapist. And so they play a very, very important role with the athlete and how they perceive their injury. And so a lot of people ask, why should sport medicine professionals be responsible for the psychological well-being of the athlete when that should be the job of the coach or of a team psychologist or something of that nature? And it's very interesting. A study conducted in 2001 suggested that the athletic trainer's listening, task appreciation, task challenging, and emotional challenge support was more influential to the injured athlete than the support of the assistant or head coach. And so that kind of shows the side of the injured athlete and how they perceive their injury with different help from their coach or psychologist or a sport medical professional. And so that shows that SMPs really do play a very important role post-injury for these athletes. Some other interesting literature that I ran across broke down the post-injury thought processes into 3 different phases. And so each one of these, the first one includes reaction to injury, reaction to rehabilitation, and then the third is reaction to the return to sport. And so this is over the phase of actually being injured, from initial injury to completely rehabilitated. And so each phase then had its own specific theme. So reaction to injury was themed having perceived injury severity influencing their appraisal, influencing how they see their injury and what's going on with them. Their reaction to rehabilitation included thoughts that question the rehabilitation process, so that's also important to keep in mind. And then once they get to the phase of the reaction to return to sport, you really see them the athlete looking back on what lessons they learned throughout that process. And so this research in the Journal of Athletic Training showed that during this initial phase, the reaction to injury phase, the emotion that the athlete leaned toward most seemed to continuously influence the rehabilitation process and phases thereafter. And so we see that this reaction to injury is one of the most important phases to intervene in as any type of professional, a psychologist, a coach, a sport medicine professional. And so if an athlete were to have a negative reaction to their injury at first, that same negativity could later potentially weave itself back into the recovery process. And so it's very important to be educated in these processes and knowing what an athlete would be going through so that you can intervene and help them kind of combat those negative thoughts. Another important aspect to injury is social support. The study I previously mentioned also talked about how the most common reaction to injury that these athletes have is seeking social support. And really, social support is something that is very easily given as SMPs, sport medicine professionals, as long as we are aware that we need to give it. Social support gives athletes a feeling of control because the athlete experiencing the injury did not choose to have that injury, and so they feel out of control. And so to give them some control back, they get to choose who they let into their rehabilitation process. And so this social support gives them that feeling of control, which then aids with more positive reinforcement and thought processes for these athletes. The most important part of this social support, though, as it pertains to sport medicine professionals, is it must be a match between what the recipient or the athlete needs and what the provider or the SMP is willing to and able to give. And so there has to be a match. The SMP has to be willing to put in that work psychologically with their patient or their athlete in order to get a full rehabilitation process. It's very, very important. So people will ask, why aren't these SMPs educated? Why can't they implement this stuff? Well, a study conducted in 2003 asked these questions to sport medicine professionals. First, are you aware of your vital role in the psychological recovery of an athlete? And two, do you feel prepared to aid in this mental recovery process? And so it's very important to ask these questions to the professionals who are the ones making the interventions. And so it's very interesting to see the responses because these PTs answer these questions very interestingly. And so most of them said that yes, they are aware of that psychological recovery and their role in that, and that no, they do not feel prepared to aid in this mental recovery process because they don't have the proper education for it. And furthermore, these physical therapists were asked these questions, and they said they still implement certain psychological techniques even though they know that they are not well prepared to do so because they know how important it is to address these problems. And so there's no uniform evidence-based psychological approach to aid injured athletes that PTs or athletic trainers can use. And so without this, there's no scientific backing as to whether the psychology aid that is given by these PTs or athletic trainers is even helpful or valid for these athletes. So how do we fix this problem? How do we bridge the gap between the lack of knowledge of the psychology of the injured athlete and how we can implement a program for these athletes as sport medicine professionals? So as many of y'all probably know, there's sport medicine programs out there, both undergrad, graduate, and then there's also continuing education courses. And so I think that really it's just a matter of implementing these courses as a prerequisite for being in the profession. And so on the undergraduate level, you have many ways to implement it, including what we're doing right now, taking a sports psychology class. I am not an SPL or sport management major. However, I do understand that in a kinesiology program like APHM or even sport health management, understanding the psychology of injury is very, very important. And so taking these classes are important at this level. However, in a lot of programs, they are not required, and I think they should be. Furthermore, in graduate courses, like in physical therapy, which is a graduate program, there should be an implementation of a education of the psychosocial responses of not even just injured athletes, but injured people, because that's all you're dealing with in physical therapy. And then athletic training specified to sport, because that's usually where you see most of your athletic trainers. Furthermore, in personal training, I feel that there is risk to injury no matter what you're doing. And so these online certifications like NASM or the Cooper Clinic need to be implementing certain psychological education courses in the programs. Furthermore, after you even get out of school, you have continuing education courses that are required for PTs, ATs, even doctors to maintain their licenses. And so if these courses are continually offered for professionals, they can keep up with this research on the injured athlete and maintain a better standard of care for our injured athletes. So that concludes my presentation on the psychosocial process of the rehabilitation of the athlete and how sport medicine professionals need to be involved in that process. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.